This is Tell Me What It's Like, a show about defining moments, life-changing decisions, and extraordinary challenges. I'm Stacey Rain. In 2018, Suzanne Smith got a call from Dallas's leading LGBTQIA+ organization because they needed some guidance. More people than ever needed their help, and they needed to expand their services. So they called Suzanne. She's the CEO of Social Impact Architects, where she helps nonprofits with strategy, preparing them for growth and for long-term sustainability. Suzanne, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while.
Me too, because I love talking about nonprofits. So let's first talk about your background. You've got a long history with social change, with nonprofits, and you've helped a lot of groups make important change. So let's talk about your background.
Yes, well, it's not often that I get to actually get interviewed by someone who's actually worked in the nonprofit space too. So I hope we'll have a fantastic conversation that will really spark a whole lot of good thinking on the part of your listeners. So thank you for having me on. So honestly, it started when I was a kid. I talk about the fact that I was raised by people who were change makers. And so we talked about social issues at the dinner table, literally. Like we couldn't come to the dinner table without reading the Dallas Morning News and having opinions on different things. And then my parents would all of a sudden say, well, we'll argue the other side. What do you think about this? And so I, of course, thought every child grew up that way. I then realized that not every child grows up that way. And so I grew up also in a political family that saw change and was part of making change happen. My dad actually ran for county commissioner. And so I actually saw change from a lot of different angles. So people will say they're not surprised. My parents would say they're not surprised that I ended up in this spot. So from there, I actually was a lobbyist and worked in the nonprofit space and was lucky enough to work for two nonprofits myself. So I was knee deep in the work. But one of the things I saw was the fact that the issues were scaling, but the organizations were not scaling along them. So we have 1.5 million nonprofits across the country. And as you see now, the world is chaotic. But yet nonprofits, as I jokingly say, they're running off lemonade stand budgets. They're not scaled at the level to solve these problems. And I was working for organizations that actually had more resources. And so what I did is I went back to business school and actually went to Duke, studied there, and really found the intersection of government, nonprofit, and business. And so I talk about the fact that I'm trilingual, that I speak all three languages, which is really what you need to do social change because change happens at that intersection. And so after business school, I founded Social Impact Architects 16 years ago. I also now am lucky enough to actually teach. And so I actually teach exec ed as well as undergrads. I call it the fountain of youth because teaching young people is one of my favorite things to do, but it keeps me young. And then I also, for the past 13 years, have written a weekly blog. So it's a routine I do every week, which is one of the top blogs on Substack on social change called Social Trend Spotter. So those are the different areas in which I play. I love social change. It is not a job. It is definitely a calling, as you well know.
When you say social change, can you define that for me?
It's interesting. I talk about it from two different levels, so I obviously have chosen a career in social change. And so I call myself a professional change maker. But one of the things I also am trying to inspire is everyday change making. So to me, there are people out there that should be thinking about social change, but they can do it in their jobs, so business executives who should be thinking about how do I run my company and how do I make sure that I'm contributing to the community. So Fortune 500 companies to small businesses, but there's also individuals out there who need to be change makers. They need to vote. They need to think about at a local level what they can do to make a difference. It could be cleaning up a local park. It could be fighting City Hall on something that they need. But honestly, this is where I think America has such a great long history of change making. In fact, there was a French philosopher who came to America very early on in our origin story, and he actually said that we are a nation of joiners. And one of the unique elements of who we are is the fact that Americans will roll up their sleeves, help their neighbor, fight City Hall, fight DC, and they will make a difference in the lives of other people. And so that's really what I'm trying to inspire is both the professional change maker and giving them the frameworks and tools, but also really inspiring everyday change makers to realize that their voice matters and they need to be part of the community to continue to make a difference in the issues they care most about.
And I would argue that that's probably what you were doing when you were lobbying, out of
Hmm.
college, is going to government officials and saying, hey,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about what you did back then that sort of inspired
Yeah.
this whole
So,
career?
it's interesting. We were very new in the nonprofit space doing public policy. So I was working at the American Heart Association, and one of the things we recognized is that government could be a force for good, and we needed to kind of help government think about the way in which it could actually help the everyday lives of individuals. So just to kind of create a frame, and this is one of the things I talk about in my class, is nonprofits are a relatively unique thing. We actually, if you go to other developing countries, the nonprofit sector doesn't exist. Civil
Right.
society doesn't exist. There's government and there's business. And our very origin story, we didn't have nonprofits either. It actually, if you think about the pioneer days, so if you think Little House on the Prairie time frame, you had small businesses who were, doing things, the blacksmith, the person who owned the general store, and you had limited government. And what people, again, this is what the French philosopher de Tocqueville said, then you had these people who recognized there was a missing middle. That we
Mm.
actually wanted to have a school. We wanted to have churches. We wanted to have a health clinic who would take care of people who maybe needed it. And those small businesses and the everyday citizens actually contributed to making those things happen. And that's really where the origin story of nonprofits started. And 75 years ago, Eisenhower actually codified that and said, okay, we're going to create a 501c3 so that way everyday change making can really turn into a more professional industry. And those people who were donating, businesses and people like you and I, could get that tax deduction.
Yeah.
And there was a more sophisticated structure. So we're still in the very origin of nonprofits. So going back to your question, government needs guidance. We are the government. I think oftentimes people think it is outside of ourselves, but truly we are the government in a democracy. And so I was lobbying on behalf of the American Heart Association, and it was personal to me. So what my goal for working for the Heart Association was I wanted every child to know their grandparents because I wasn't lucky enough to know my grandparents. They died of
Mm.
heart disease and stroke before I could really get to know them. And so part of what I did is work on making sure, and I'm knock on wood that this has happened, 25 years later, that people get to the hospital on time and they're able to get life-saving drugs like TPA when they get that for a stroke, and you get to live longer as a result. And so that's why the lifespans of Americans have actually extended enough where people get to know their grandparents. And my parents are still alive because of all these wonderful change makers out there, the doctors, the EMS, the 911 operators, all the people who come together to create a system to make sure that we extend the life of people. And so that's really what we lobbied for is everything from 911 to making sure EMS had access to TPA. It was a million different things that created a system that has now extended the lifespan of a whole generation of Americans. And, to this day, I think it's one of the amazing things about the United States is the fact that we have all these people, both everyday change makers and professional change makers who come together, lobby the government and say, this is something we want to do. And then those changes happen and everybody's lives has changed as a result.
I love that you called the 911 and EMS workers change makers. That
Hmm.
is, you know, when you're talking about nonprofits, you're talking about change makers, you're thinking about people inside nonprofits, but the system is
Yep,
so much bigger than just the one group doing it. It's also the donors. It's the people that are helping make it happen. It
absolutely.
is grants. It's all of these pieces that go into it. And so you launch your consulting
Mhm,
business, and you start working with nonprofits. You said that was 15 years ago.
mhm.
And
Yeah. And it's interesting because I was resistant to being a consultant because I think consultants kind of have a bad name in the
yeah,
nonprofit industry. And you probably remember this. Like a consultant is going to come in and tell us magically what we should do.
yeah.
And I had dealt with many consulting firms when I was at Phoenix House of the American Art Association. And I had a love-hate relationship with them in many ways
Yeah.
because they oftentimes would give us these grandiose plans that didn't actually um, match the budget that we actually had,
Mm,
because part of the nonprofit, I think, dynamic, which I'm hoping to change with my work, is that we oftentimes are doing it, like I said, on lemonade stand budgets. So how do you create seismic social change when you barely have the system you need internally to do those things? Um, and so that's one of the things I've been championing with a lot of the work that I've done, both my research as well as the blog, as well as the consulting work. And so I had a love-hate relationship, but what I tried to do is really think about what kind of consultant would I've liked. And instead of having someone come down from high with a bunch of frameworks and a bunch of like jargony things and charging me a huge amount of money, I created social impact architects, giving everybody access, so we're sliding scale. We're a benefit corporation, which means at the end of every year, we break even. So for the
hmm
small nonprofits, they either are pro bono or low bono. And then the large nonprofits or the large foundations or the high net worth individuals, they pay more. And that's our business proposition. And we don't work with you based on a project. We work until the work is done. And so sometimes that means I lose money on a project, but
Wow.
I don't leave until I feel like the work is done. And so I think that's really was very important. And it also means I don't give you a strategic plan. I don't give you a feasibility study. We
Mm,
co-create it together. So when
okay.
I leave, it's as much their plan as anything else. And we don't brand anything we do. So you will never find, created by social impact architects on anything because it's their plan. It's not my plan. Because if it's my plan, when I leave, it goes on the shelf somewhere and it rarely gets implemented.
hmm
And so that's our proposition to nonprofits is we're coming in as a guide. So think about if you were to scale Mount Everest, you're the one that scales Mount Everest. You're the one that takes the credit, but I'm the Sherpa that has scaled Mount Everest many, many times that gives you all the tips and tricks so that you do it successfully.
That's exactly what I was thinking
Um,
is consultants, yes, I think sometimes can get a bad rep, but also when you work with a lot of different organizations, you start to see some of the things that
mhm.
kind of happen over and over again. That's true in business, that's true in nonprofits, that's true probably everywhere, which I think is part of what organizations like social impact architects can bring to the
Yeah.
table. And I'm guessing that's probably what you brought to the table when the resource center called you back in 2018. So let's talk about that story a little bit,
Yeah.
and as sort of a lens to the nonprofit ecosystem. What was happening with them, and why did they call you?
So I love Resource Center as an example. So they are Dallas's leading LGBTQI community. But for your listeners, there are organizations like Resource Center across the United States. And there is actually an organization called CenterLink that can give you access to who those centers are and the ones that have the best strategies in your community. And so this was in 2018. And so keep in mind that was before we had some of the shifts in people's views about the LGBTQI community that has happened as of late. But I have to give a lot of credit to the CEO, CC Cox. She's a lawyer by trade, so she's deeply analytical. And so she came to me and she basically knew that she needed a growth strategy. And one of the ways that I think nonprofits are different than businesses is businesses, when they look at their strategy, they're oftentimes looking at wide. Like, how do we get bigger?
Mm,
And as I say to nonprofits, we're not about getting bigger, we're about getting better. And so sometimes getting better means going deep versus wide. And so she really wanted to look underneath the hood of her organization and say, what's working, what's not working, but also really let's prepare for the future. What are the needs of the community? And so through that strategic planning effort, where we ask the community, what are your needs? We recognize affordable housing, which I know that's in the headlines right now. But can you imagine back in 2018 that we had this conversation around we need affordable housing, and not just for everybody, but for seniors?
yeah.
Because oftentimes the seniors were having to go back in the closet when they actually went to assisted living centers. And so it was an
Oh,
opportunity for them to provide something that really didn't exist. And so when I did the original strategic plan and then we did a feasibility study around what it would look like, it was really one of the first in the nation. And 3 years ago, they actually started Oaklawn Place. It's really a very revolutionary idea. 84 units of affirming senior housing, and it's gone amazingly well. And now they're coupling it with an on-site health clinic. And so all of this was part of the design in 2018. And over time, they built the strategies little by little, bite by bite, to try to figure out how do we get there. Um, so I have to really give a lot of credit to the CEO and the executive team, as well as their board. They were all in on trying to figure out what were the things that the community needed. And so, as my students will say, where are the receipts? The receipts are that they doubled their volunteers. HIV testing has gone up by a quarter, almost 23%. Insurance assisted clients in their health clinic has increased fivefold, with more to come. And in this kind of healthcare environment, it's even more important that people have access to care and access to quality care. And they're about to launch their on-site health clinic. In fact, their grand opening is coming up in March. And so all of this was stuff that we worked on. And I think I have to give a lot of credit because a lot of this stuff was not easy.
mm-hmm.
But it was the right thing to do. And they did it in a sustainable way where bit by bit, which meant they didn't get overloaded. And it was a strategic choices all along the way to make sure that all the strategy came together to really, again, go deep in the areas where the community needed them the most.
Right. And so when you think about strengthening nonprofits, I mean, that's essentially what you came in to do, but it was also planning for the future. It's a lot of co-creating, as you said. What did you notice things about this scenario and other scenarios that you have been involved in that kind of seem to be similar across the board when it comes to nonprofit organizations?
Well, and that's why I love that you do this particular podcast, because it's like, tell me what it's like. And so now the strategic plan I'm finishing right now for a group in Bermuda will be my 150th strategic plan.
Wow.
So I have
So you've seen it.
much, I've seen the pattern, and here's the pattern. And then of course, now that I've seen the pattern, I can figure out like, what's the solution? And so I'd say the big pattern is that we really didn't have a framework. The biggest framework we had, because nonprofits were only 75 years old, is act more like business. And unfortunately, nonprofits are not businesses. That is not how that framework is not an appropriate terminology. I usually reframe it with people, even though I'm an MBA and I love business. We need to use business principles, and many of the frameworks in business have to be properly translated for the
Mm-hmm.
nonprofit space. And so one that I properly translated is called the flywheel effect. And so some of you may be familiar with that because it was in a book by Jim Collins, and Good to Great. And what he did is he looked at all the highest performing corporations and said, what do they have alike? And so this flywheel is this idea that you kind of creates success. And so the way I describe a flywheel for people who don't remember their physics class from high school is thinking about when you were a kid on a bicycle. And there was this lovely moment when you actually knew how to actually ride that bicycle, and you were riding it with just the most intent. And all of a sudden you take your feet off the pedals and the bicycle continues to move forward through its own momentum. Like you
Mm-hmm.
don't have to work so hard. And so that's really what Jim Collins was talking about in a business context, is how do you create a flywheel where the momentum takes on? And so that's what I tell people is I give you a strategic plan or a strategy, but what I'm really giving you is clarity and momentum. And so the flywheel that we reconstructed based on Jim's amazing strategy and translated for the nonprofit space is this idea of, first, the thing that nonprofits need to pay most attention to. In the for-profit space, we look at the bottom line. Our bottom line is impact. At the end of the day, we need to create impact. And it has to be data-driven impact. We live in a
Mm-hmm.
place where, in God we trust, all other people need to bring data. And
Ah.
so nonprofits have to be data driven. And so we have to create impact, and donors are looking for it. Employees are looking for it. Let's create impact. So that's the first part of the flywheel. That's the product and service that we're creating for the community. And then from there, we actually then move to brand. And so as a Texan, I call impact the steak. Brand is the sizzle. Like you
Ah.
need the steak and the sizzle.
Yeah.
And so we moved to a place, and I think social media has just accelerated this, where you can't just do good work and hope people are going to pay attention. Like you have to tell them you're doing the good work, and you have to invite them to be part of the story so that they want to be a donor, they want to be a volunteer, and ultimately maybe even an employee, like I wanted
Mhm.
to for the Heart Association. So the flywheel is impact and then brand. And what Jim proved, and I've proven in my research as well over the last 15 years, is if you deliver impact and you deliver brand, and the revenue will take care of itself. That people will donate,
Mhm.
people will contribute because they see you've got the receipts,
Yeah.
and they know about the work that you're doing. And then when you're able to raise the money, operations is the next part of the wheel. You can then plow that money into operations so that you can have the best IT, you can have the best employees and pay them a fair wage. You can have the right systems. And that's the reinforcing loop. That
Yeah.
then all of that gets plowed into more impact, which is what CC did in the example with Resource Center. And that's why they've grown. So they've gone from a $10 million organization in 2018 to now a $26 million organization. So they grew because they actually invested in themselves, and they invested in their infrastructure, and they responded to community need, and they told a great story. So people like myself would donate. And so, of course, nestled in the middle is governance. You got to have a great board,
Mhm.
and you got to have people who are willing to champion your cause. And then, of course, a good culture, and a
Mhm.
culture that really embraces entrepreneurship, innovation, accountability, and all of those things. And so we've developed this flywheel model that really helps people not focus on one thing, but focuses on all things so that they truly can get that momentum. And that's really what a strategic plan is all about, is looking at each of those component parts and working on them individually, but then recognizing it's a collective whole as well.
You've mentioned your research a couple of times, and I'm curious to know, where that is happening. Is it happening sort of in real time with the different organizations you're working with, or is it happening sort of, academically? Like, what does that look like for you?
So we both and
Okay.
so I have partnered with nonprofits. As I said, once a client, always a client. And
Yeah.
so, so I get the details from CC of like where they were before, where they are after. And candidly, my first 10 strategic plans weren't great. In fact, I
Mm.
recently went back and looked at them, and I realized they were missing a whole lot of things. And so some
Yeah,
of this is me, that repetition that I have built over time,
for
where
sure.
I recognize what's the difference between an operating plan versus a strategic plan, and what really creats the lift for an organization that they need. Um, we also now have paired strategic planning with capacity building
Mhm.
and change management strategies. And so that was our big innovation 8 years ago, is we now couple every strategic plan with the change management plan, and making sure that they have the levers they need in order to make sure that change actually happens and is sustained without us being involved. Because
Yeah.
keep in mind, I walk away, and they're the ones that continue to work because we co-created it. So I've done it in partnership with my clients. They know that I'm doing this because not because I want to be a consultant, but because I want to create social change alongside them.
Mhm.
And that's my calling. The other thing, I also have gotten some great assistance from the universities that I work with, and then many of the community organizations. So the foundations, organizations like TACA, we have actually done the research around arts organizations and taking them through the flywheel and seeing their growth over time. So we actually just did a cohort, our third cohort. We've now gone back to a year one cohort with arts organizations that were small. So many people may look at Resource Center and go, well, they're really large, so it's easy for them. These were micro organizations, micro nonprofits. We put them through the flywheel, and each one of them have seen anywhere from 30 to 50% growth
Wow.
in that 2-year period. because of the work we did with them in both the flywheel, as well as creating a strategic plan, as well as creating a more compelling value proposition in their donor relations. And so I do a lot of different research. I'm really careful because I think it's, doing this research is really important to make sure people know what really works and what really doesn't work. And so my clients are partners in that research.
Right. One thing you mentioned that I think is super important is sort of the internal cultural change, and I think that happens inside nonprofits, but I also think it happens across the country in terms of when people think about nonprofits. You mentioned making sure that you can invest in things like operations and marketing. I've heard so many times, 98 cents on the dollar goes to, our programs. And it's like, well, you do have to actually pay someone so that they can work, because they also need to eat and they need to pay their rent and they need to do all of these things that every, normal everyday American has to do to, live life. Is that something that you sort of battle internally in nonprofits as well as externally with board members or whomever it may be?
This is why I love talking with you, because kind of the nonprofit dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think, because we're still a young industry, 75 years ago, a lot of the people who were working in nonprofit were volunteering.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I remind people of is the American lifestyle allowed for that, because you really only needed one person to be the breadwinner. And so a lot of women were many times the people who started these nonprofits. So think Clara Barton and the American
Yeah.
Red Cross, or, and I've given countless examples. I call them the founding mothers in many ways of these
I love that.
nonprofits who really changed the course of our history, and have made a difference, in lots of different issue areas, including Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and all of these people who've made a huge difference. And so, but now we live in a society where you have to have a two-income household.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I'm trying to combat is, there's a really, heartbreaking statistic that almost 25% of nonprofit employees are not making a living wage.
Mm-hmm.
They're having to, seek food stamps and social services. And that just breaks my heart. We can't continue to run our systems, these systems that need to be well operating, on the backs and the sacrifice of people. And so one of the things I did as a call to action to my brothers and sisters in the nonprofit space is we need to do a better job of that. And so in many of the strategic plans I've been doing over the last 5 years, quietly, is I've really goaled a number of hospitals and a number of groups saying, how do we get over time everybody in your organization making a living wage?
Mm-hmm.
How do we make sure that they're getting their health care? So I have an arts group very recently who is a dance company who decided at their gala that they were going to provide health insurance for all dancers. So when
Yeah.
I tell that story to people, they're like, well, why wouldn't you provide health insurance for dancers? Like, all people, dancers need health insurance.
Yeah.
They need to make sure that they're going to a chiropractor and all the things that they do to contort their bodies. Of course, they need health care. And so I think I just tell the everyday American, look, here's the thing. If we want to have, a thriving country where we have quality of life because we have amazing arts organizations that are doing their part, we have a strong social safety net, we need to make sure that we have a profession that is well funded and paid. And I can tell them, I will vouch for the nonprofit space, you will too, that all of these people are hardworking people. And
Right.
all of these things that you hear about what nonprofits are doing or not doing, they're the anomaly. They're not the everyday nonprofit and how hard nonprofit people work. They're the first in and last out. You go into any crisis situation, whether it's very recently with the government shutdown, and they were, the first people in trying to figure out how they were going to increase food bank usage for federal employees and other people who are relying on food banks.
Yes.
And they're usually the last out in any crisis. And they're still dealing with the ramifications of that. Or if you think about, weather crises, they're the first ones in after a tornado or after flooding, and they're still trying to recover even when the headlines go away.
Right.
And so these nonprofit people deserve our respect. They deserve to be paid appropriately. And there's not fluff in nonprofits' budgets. That just doesn't exist. And so if you want strong systems that build quality of life and a strong social safety net, we have to fund it.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I remind everyday Americans is we're all one crisis away
Yep.
from needing that social safety net. You're one car accident, you're one loss of a job, you're one, and some of us have families who could support us, but others need a social safety net to help us that one time when something happens that's the unexpected and we need to kind of level up and we need to have people to support us, whether it's a therapist, whether it's, a food bank, whether it's a workforce retraining program. And with AI, I think this is going to happen in a quicker clip because there's going to be more and more people who are on unsteady ground. And we need that social safety net to be strong. And right now it's very weak. And it's in part because we're underfunding it.
Right.
So I think this is why I'm making it my calling in the next 15 years to really help reframe how people think about the nonprofit space and really be the myth buster around a lot of these really unfortunate narratives that make it difficult for us to have that strong safety net.
Yeah. It's also a competitiveness thing in terms of, I think Dan Pilato was the one that talked a lot about,
Yep.
you can either be the person who's running a nonprofit and not making, enough money to live on, or, with your MBA that you spent thousands upon thousands of dollars on, you can go and work somewhere else and be on that board, So how do you incentivize people to put their talents and expertise into all the places we need it, not just in business, but in nonprofits?
Well, and I love that you mentioned that because that's why I equally focus on everyday change makers because business wants to be a force for good too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, over 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs have a CSR report, a corporate social responsibility report. More and more small businesses are recognizing that you and I want to actually frequent businesses that actually create social change,
Yeah.
or, are part of social change. And so it's not only the right thing to do anymore, it makes business sense. It's a competitive advantage for them to be part of a conversation around social change. And so I equally spend time with corporations and just small business owners to help them think about how do you not only make money, but how do you also make a difference? And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that's partnered with a nonprofit, but sometimes that's really just thinking about how much are you paying your employees? What could you be giving back to the community? What asset do you have that could be supportive of community change? And so I always
Mm-hmm.
highlight organizations, companies like Toyota, who they're the first group that goes into food banks and helps them make them more efficient. And
Mm,
who's better at efficiency than Toyota?
that's cool.
I have a small business that I worked with that was a franchise owner of a bunch of oil change places, and they adopt a local after school program and they actually give money to that after school program, but they also teach auto mechanics.
Oh,
And
wow.
so they now some of the people who came through that after school program are working and have summer jobs at that location. And so it's these small acts of change that are really what's part of the fabric of who we are as Americans. And so I just want to inspire people to do more and realize any little bit they can do makes a big difference in the lives of other people.
I love these examples of people who maybe aren't working in a nonprofit because,
Hmm.
they're a car mechanic, but they still can participate in
Yeah.
making our communities better places and making more opportunities for
Well,
everybody.
I call it the 4 T's framework. And for you to really think about what T is best for you, time, so
Mhm.
you can give your time. So the number one way I encourage people to give their time is to be a mentor. Right
Mm.
now, Big Brothers Big Sisters needs male mentors in particular. I became a big at 18, and it was probably one of the most transformative things I've done in my life.
Yeah.
And certainly I've gotten as much out of it, if not more, than I actually gave. Being on a nonprofit board, you mentioned that. That actually helps on a lot of levels. It helps
Mhm.
also even improves your resume. It actually builds leadership skills. So that's time, talent. Maybe your talent is, um, you know, helping with websites, or maybe your talent, like with Toyota, is efficiency. Like, so leveraging your talent, your God-given gift, and actually helping a nonprofit with that. And then treasure, of course, we want people to donate. That donation makes a big difference. I encourage people to just forego one Starbucks every week and decide, I'm going to on a regular basis give back to organizations that I've been impacted by. So maybe it's that mentorship organization, maybe it's a healthcare charity for a disease that you feel like you want to do something about. And then, of course, testimony. We live in the social media age, so your voice really matters. And so testimony about issues that matter to you. So
Yeah.
I'm encouraging people to do less doom scrolling and more hope scrolling, like talk about things that we can actually make a difference in. And it really makes a big difference for you to go on social media and talk about, here's an issue that I care about, and here's how we should fight City Hall to make this happen. Or, get a speed bump, because people are running through your road too fast. I mean, that small stuff actually makes a big difference.
You are such a positive person, but you are working you spent your life, your career working, in places where there's a lot of need. Do you ever, I guess, how do you stay so positive, and do you ever get frustrated?
Oh, it's such a great question. I definitely get frustrated. I think I get frustrated at the pace of change, which is why I went to business school. And I really have to thank Duke for kind of giving me the power tools, because I was frustrated with like the secondhand hammer and, tools that I was able to get. And I actually really felt like I got power tools. And that's why I'm passing those power tools along to people.
Yeah.
So I think I channel my frustration into positive change. And so again, I got that from my parents, so my mom was a counselor, my dad was a football coach. So they only gave me like one day to, if something bad happened to me at school, they were like, okay, you can feel your feelings. But then my dad the next day would say, now what are you going to do differently tomorrow? The only person you're competing with is the person you were yesterday. So what are you going to do differently? And so I just think, again, I got that wisdom from that dinner table and their coaching. And so, yeah, I definitely have frustrating days, and I go do all my self-care things to kind of feel the feelings. And then the next day I wake up and I'm like, okay, what am I now going to do about it?
Yeah.
And sometimes I find friends, so it can be a lonely business, as you know. And so I've got a lot of friends that I'll call, and, we do it together.
Right. So from you said you've done 150, I think, strategic plans. So you've worked with a lot of organizations. You were very good at channeling your frustration. From everything you've seen from, all the businesses and nonprofits out there, like what's your sort of advice to them? What do you say? Like, if you really want to make change, if you want to grow and be able to increase your impact, as you say, what is it that you tell them?
So I think one of the hard parts about nonprofit, to your point, is the need is so large. And so one of the hard parts about being in the nonprofit space, and arguably I also deal with this too, is a scattershot approach. And so I have so many ideas. It's one of the reasons why I teach entrepreneurship, is because every entrepreneur has lots of ideas. But part of what you learn as an entrepreneur, and I hope I teach my students this discipline, is then where to focus. And where to focus is strategy. And strategy is equally important in a strategic plan. But I also tell my students the most strategic decision you're going to make every single day is how you spend your time and who you spend your time with. And so to me, I think the biggest piece of advice I will tell people is move away from kind of this sacrifice mentality where everything is scattershot. Every need, you're moving in like a superhero trying to solve for every need. And as you know, you do that at a mediocre level, and choose to be strategic. Like, figure out the things that you're best equipped with, where there's the most market opportunity, where you can get the greatest impact, and channel your efforts. And that's what strategy is all about, is channeling your efforts. And that's where excellence comes from, is that level of strategic thinking.
Yeah. And strategy is really, like you said, it's thinking about the things that really have to get done and making, knowing what you want to do and then creating a plan to do it. Would you say that's pretty accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's just an easy trap for people who are do-gooders to fall into. There's so much need. How do you say yes and no to certain people? But I keep reminding people that the first person you need to be saying yes to is yourself.
Yeah.
You need to be really thinking about self-care and where you choose to sacrifice, but also saying no means you're saying yes to other things. And doing those things with integrity and with excellence. And that's really what people deserve. That's what people in need deserve is excellence. Or, we deserve, art productions that are excellent. We deserve social safety net that is excellent. We deserve all of that. And so that's what I would say. I think, starting with a strategic mindset is the best advice I give people.
And you have a new book coming out where people can get some of that information and resource help. Can you give us a little bit as we close, talk about that?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you asking about that. So I didn't plan to be an author, but this, just like everything, it comes from my clients. I run a weekly blog and I've been doing it for 13 years. And so not everybody has joined me 13 years ago. They've been along the journey and I've recently gone on Substack. And so people will say, where's the blog on this? Where's the blog on that? I'm like, oh, I wrote it 7 years ago. So someone said to me, actually, and my mother actually endorsed this too. She's like, you need to write this book and just put all your blogs together.
Yeah.
And so that's what I've done. It's kind of a compilation of different blogs at different times. They've all been updated to 2025 standards. So they're kind of in the latest context of AI and all sorts of things. And so we're going to be putting that out free of charge. It's going to be a digital download. And you're also going to be able to, if you're like me and want a hard copy, and my mom, of course, is going to get an autographed hard copy too, because it was partially her idea. We'll also be finding ways for you to do that through Amazon and other kind of publishers so that you can get a printed version that is at cost.
That's awesome. I think that's going to be a super important resource and benefit for people who are working to make change. So, Suzanne, thank you so much for joining me to talk about all of your work and how to strengthen nonprofits.
Well, thank you for bringing this to the forefront because I think it's such an important element. And I would just encourage people, if they're interested, to go to the website, socialimpactarchitects.com, and to really, not be a bystander in the world of social change, to just choose one thing that you're deeply passionate about and just decide to do something differently about it. Use your voice, use your money, use your time, use your talent. One of those four, I promise you will feel a difference in your life and you'll be making a countless difference in the lives of other people.
Thanks to Suzanne Smith for joining me to talk about strengthening nonprofits. If this episode was helpful, please leave a rating and review in your podcast app to help others find it. Next week, meet Genevieve Kirthanay and learn more about planning our cities. I'm Stacey Rain. Thanks for listening.